Okay, so this is AP Lit. We're reviewing chapters 11 through 18. There's some things I wanted to share. One of the things I mentioned this before that would help you in a book like this. There are no titles for the chapters, so if you give the chapters titles, like chapter 11 would be I think you would just identify what's in it. Huck as Sarah Williams. This is the chapter where he disguises himself as a girl, and we already talked about that. And we learned that and these are really important things that I expect you to remember about the book. Just one of many times where he can think on his feet. He's not educated, but it doesn't mean he's not smart. Those two combinations are incredible. Be smart and educated, boy, you're unstoppable. But you can be smart and not educated, that's a shame. You can be educated and not smart. Well, a lot of us aren't smart, but we all got a reasonable amount of intelligence. That's better than be smart and not educated. But anyway, he's able to think. He's a good liar. He's got a good imagination. He's cool under pressure. I think any of us would like to be that way. Like you're asked something, you're not prepared for the answer. You think quickly. When things bad happen, are you able to think through them, or do you panic? If something happened on the way to school, would you panic, or would you, okay, what can I do to get out? How can I fix this? Anyway, that's Huck. That's important. The chapter ends with the statement, and I think this is really important. They're after us. Again, I would expect you to use that, or be able to use that in a discussion of the relationship between Huck and Jim, because they weren't after us. They were after Jim. They thought Jim had killed Huck. They thought Huck was dead, so they're not after Huck. So why does he say they're after us? Yeah.
I mean, we kind of touched on this last week, but I'm just stating that, instead of there not being a relationship and there being some sort of social warfare, Jim is starting to see, or not Jim, Huck is starting to see Jim as equal to
Yes.
Huck. They're kind of in the same situation. So.
Exactly. They're partners. They're friends. So that's really important. It's not the end of their growth, but it's an indication that it's getting better. Chapter 12, I'd call the wrecked steamboat, because there's several things in grading your papers. I think I graded them, or maybe I still have them to grade. I think I've graded the other class. I asked you what happened on the wrecked steamboat. Most of you got that right. Also asked, where does he show a lack of sentimentality? And I don't know exactly how you did, but a lot of people, I'm trying to give credit. I'm not, this is not really for interpretation, and the questions are designed for comprehension. Like, did you read it? That's really what they were designed for. So I'm very liberal in my, what I allow, okay? But the best answers, and had several people do it, at the end of this chapter, at the end of chapter 12, and in the beginning of chapter 13, how does he and Jim get off the boat, the wrecked steamboat? What?
Steal the robber's boat.
Yeah, so how does that show a lack of sentimentality?
He is leaving.
What? I just couldn't hear either one of them. Yeah.
He's just leaving the robbers to die.
He says, well, I catch my breath and almost fainted. Shut up on that wreck with such a gang as that. But it weren't no time for sentimentering. That's his way of saying there's no time to be sentimental. It's either us or them, and that's a no-brainer. It's going to be us. So I think that's an important thing. That's an important theme in this book. Emotional people don't make good decisions. And here's a time you can't be emotional. Let's just do what's best. You all drown, right? Nobody's going to live. So that's important. It also, one thing I want you to note is when Jim lies, he often creates for himself families. Like he was trying to get help for these guys, and so he actually leaves after he and Jim escape, and he's trying to get help, and he lies. He says, ma'am, Pap and ma'am and sis, and You know, he's trying to tell a story about them being stuck on a steamboat. He's trying to get help for these guys. He's not being sentimental about it, but he is not being hard-hearted either. Yeah.
I was kind of thinking about that the other day, and I wonder if that's like some sort of psychological issue that Huck has because he doesn't have a family.
Absolutely.
So it's probably something that he thinks about a lot.
Absolutely.
It's the easiest thing for him to come up with.
And that's important to note. He's got a great imagination, but it's sad at the same time. He doesn't have brothers. He doesn't have a pap. He doesn't have a mother. And at the end of this, he says this. I don't know what page it is. Next to last paragraph of the chapter. He does make an effort to find those guys he left on board. And eventually, he sees the boat going down the Mississippi, and he says this. Well, before long, here comes the wreck, dim and dusky, sliding along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was deep, I see in a minute. There wasn't no chance of anybody being alive in her. I pulled around her, hollered a little, and there wasn't any answer, all dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckoned if they could stand it, I could. So it's another admission that, yeah, I kind of felt a little bad for them, and not too much. Do you remember Emmeline Grangerford? We're going to look at her again. She's the exact opposite. She makes her life, as short as it was, about sentimentalism. She spends her whole life thinking about death and thinking about people dying and writing about it and drawing pictures about it. So she is the opposite of Huck. And Mark Twain makes fun of her. And he applauds this behavior, this attitude. Yeah, they didn't deserve a lot of emotions. They're bad guys. I tried to help, I couldn't, so be it. That's kind of a healthy attitude. All right, the chapter 14 is when they discuss, and I won't bother. I used to like to read part of this, but at the end, it's chapter 14, and I titled it King Solomon and the Frenchman, because they talk about kings, and then they talk about speaking French, and I won't go into this now, but when they talk about kings, and remember later in the book, they meet a king and a duke, and so there are no kings and dukes in America, but what were in America? There were the Grangerfords. They were like kings and dukes. They were the aristocrats of the, whatever you want to call it, of the Middle West. You know, these people, these wealthy landowners, they were like kings and dukes, and look how violent they were. Look how foolish they were. Look how well they lived, but they didn't mind killing other people. So that's one of the criticisms in the book is the idea of that aristocratic. He makes fun of that class of people. And he and Jim are talking about speaking French. You remember that little thing? Do you remember that? If you turn to the last paragraph, well, I don't know where it is. It's the last couple of paragraphs. He says, "Shucks, it ain't calling you anything." He says, "Parlez-vous français," or it says something in French. Yeah, he says, "Parlez-vous français," and Jim thinks he's cussing at him. And he says, "Shucks, do you know what page it is? Have you got it?"
Oh, I think so.
Okay, everybody see where it is? Shucks, I ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, do you know how to talk French? And Jim says, well, then why couldn't he say it? And Huck says, well, he is saying it. That's the way French say it. And Jim says, well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no more about it. There ain't no sense in it. And then Huck says, looky here, Jim. Does a cat, now this is so clever. Does a cat talk like we do? No, a cat don't. Well, does a cow? No, a cow don't neither. Does a cat talk like a cow, or a cow talk like a cat? No, they don't. It's natural and right for them to talk different from each other, ain't it? And Jim says, of course. So Huck is using logic to try to make his point. And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us? And Jim says, why, most surely it is. Well, then why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that. So he thinks he's got Jim with this unassailable logic, and he says, and then Jim says, is a cat a man, Huck? No. Well, then there ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man, or is a cow a cat? No, she ain't neither of them. Well, then she ain't got no business to talk like either of them either. Is a Frenchman a man? Yes. Well, then, Dad, blame it. Why don't he talk like a man? You answer me that. So what Jim does, he takes the very logic that Huck used against him and turned it, and basically saying what's so obvious about his analogy was that cats and dogs, of course they don't talk like men, because they're not men. And so Jim is trying to say, well then, why doesn't, Frenchman is a man, and he says, why don't they talk like a man? Of course, the funny part is, it's just another language. But the important thing is, Huck says this, I see it weren't no use wasting words. You can't learn a slave, and uses the N-word to argue. Anytime he is trying to insult Jim or gets bested by Jim, he pulls out the racial language. And think about it. Isn't that exactly true? Why anybody would use a language like that? Because it's so simple to call somebody a bad name rather than to deal with them as an individual. And that person over there may be a whole lot smarter than you, and for a white person at this time, that was not possible. But it was. Jim is as smart or smarter than Huck. And Huck couldn't stand that, so he uses the N-word. That's another thing to just make a note of. It just shows you that Huck is racist. He's just 14 years old. Do we give him a break? Maybe so. But he is. He's that way. But he's learning. He's learning not to be, because every time he's around Jim, he realizes this guy's pretty smart. This guy's a really nice guy. This guy is a great family man. For white people at that time who didn't know any black people, they would call them things like that because they were racist. All right, chapter 5. This is the fog. Where were they planning to go? Where was Jim and Huck planning to go? Where? Where were they planning? Like the whole plan for being on the river was to go where? To a free state. So the only way they could get to a free state, which Illinois was a free state, but remember, what was the problem with Illinois? It's right, he could just cross the river. It'd be in Illinois, a free state. But what was the problem with that?
It's too close.
Well, it is. But what else is the problem? Do you know anything about the Fugitive Slave Act? What was that? Yeah, it was on the books, wasn't it, for like decades, but nobody enforced it? And then they had one of those compromises. Was it Compromise 1850? All right, and so now they were going to enforce it. This book takes place probably in the 1850s. So that was why he didn't go to, that's why he didn't go to Illinois. So where else could you go? If you couldn't go to a free state, like New York was a free state, probably. Yeah, well, they all were. The northern states were. Why is that a not safe place? So if you couldn't go to a free state in America, where could you go? Yeah, absolutely. And so how do you get to Canada from the Mississippi River? Now you could have gone north, which would have made sense, right? Just go cross the border. They didn't think of that. So they go down the river. So how do they get north by going south? The Ohio River empties into the Mississippi River. So that's why they're looking for Cairo, C-A-I-R-O. At Cairo, what do they plan to do? You can't sail up a river. You can sail a raft down a river because the river is doing all the work. So how do you get up a river? Steamboat. And so what are they planning to do?
He's supposed to get on and travel over.
That's right. They're going to ditch the raft, get a steamboat on the Ohio, sail up the Ohio, and eventually get to Canada.
Yeah.
But there's fog. What happens in the fog?
They get lost.
They miss Cairo. So now they're south of Cairo, what's the only way now to get back to Cairo? Like, what do they do now? They got to ditch the raft, work their way back up, and then get to the Ohio. But what happens to prevent that?
Get split up.
How does that happen? It was one of the questions on the quiz.
One of the boats goes through.
The steamboat
Runs.
runs right over it, and they both dive out, and Huck ends up in front of the Grangerford mansion in the middle of the night.
Answer because he's scared he's gonna get taken away.
Right. One interesting thing about that is Huck says that sometimes they do that on purpose. I mean, at night you can't, that's why you have to have a running light of some kind. But sometimes the steamboats, just for fun, do that. They just run over little ships, you know, the guys just having some fun up there.
Boys being boys.
Yeah. And remember this whole scene about the fog? What happens to their relationship during that?
I guess.
You remember the scene where they get separated by the fog, but they come back together, and Huck pretends what?
It was all like a dream.
Yeah. And how does Jim handle that?
He gets pretty
Like,
mad.
okay.
Yeah. He says, he says this, I'm really, I put a lot of stress as a reader of your essays, for your using quotations. They're almost unassailable. I mean, it is like the perfect proof that something is true in a literary sense if you can quote a person in the text or quote the text in any way. So you want proof for any of your positions that you take, quote it. And that also shows you know the book. You just thumb through it or look at your Cliff Notes, whatever you're using, they don't help you with that. You may know vaguely what happens, but you're not going to be able to know it like in your mind very well. So anyway, he says this. He basically says, how could you make a fool of old Jim with a lie? That truck is trash, and trash is what people that puts dirt on the head of their friends and makes them ashamed. He tells Jim that. I mean, Huck says it is trash when you make fun of your friends and make your friends ashamed. And he goes into the hut that they have there, and this is what Huck says. It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself too, and he uses the N-word again. But I done it, and I weren't sorry for it afterwards neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks. I wouldn't have done that one if I'd known it would have made him feel that way. So he goes from, remember the first time they took the hat, and no problems with that. The snake skin, how does he feel when he uses the snake skin? You remember?
Just like, I mean, we start to see that he starts blaming stuff on it in chapter 16, but at the beginning he was just kind of like, oh, I guess you are right.
But he did feel bad about Jim getting bit by the snake, but he didn't say he did it. He didn't confess. He certainly didn't apologize. Here, his relationship is developed that he actually apologizes. But he says it like he uses the racial slur again. You don't apologize to slaves. That's the rule, and he does, because a slave is just property. You don't have to worry about their feelings. Chapter 16, this is the slave catchers, if you want to title it. It's the slave, this is where Huck's conscience gets to him, and this is another stage in his development. What is, he's going to give him away, but what keeps him from giving him away? Davis, you remember?
Is because didn't Jim refer to his friends?
Yeah. As Huck was leaving to actually turn Jim in, Jim kept complimenting him and saying what a friend he has. So when they show up, the slave catchers show up, he can't do it. And he makes up another story about his parents on board and his family and smallpox and everything. Again, using his intelligence, which is what ends the chapter. This is chapter 16. It ends this chapter when they get run over by the steamboat. So now the last two chapters, and this is some of the most important side of important part of the book. Chapter 17, I put the Grangerfords and Shepherdsons, the bright side. And then chapter 18, I put the Grangerfords and Shepherdsons, the dark side. Because in the first, we see the way they live, and Huck is fine, and they're fine, and he's having a good time. But then in the second chapter is when the feud flares up, and things turn really dark. And these are people that he admires, and we won't go into too much detail here, but remember, he admires them. He thinks they're great. But what are they?
Not that great.
And because what do?
They murder each other.
They literally murder. They'd shoot a Sanderford in the back. They would betray a Sanderford. I mean, they're terrible people, and yet they have the appearance of being very upstanding people. And so that's what you get in chapter 17. You get it, the bad part in chapter 18. I'd like to finish with this. Would you turn to whatever page it is? You can find it. It's the very end of chapter 17 with the poem Ode to Stephen Dowling Botts, deceased.
What is it?
It's called Ode to Stephen Dowling Botts, deceased. It's right at the end of chapter 17. Max, would you read that? And then what I want you to do, I want you to tell me why this is this poem is satirical, or should say a parody. What's funny about the poem? If you don't laugh, then that's a problem, because it is intended to be funny. And your job is, okay, I don't think it's funny, but what am I missing? So it is a great example of a parody, or you could even say satire, but Max.
And did young Stephen sicken?
Always start with the title.
Ode to Stephen Dowling Botts, deceased. And did young Stephen sicken? And did young Stephen die? And did the sad hearts thicken? And did the mourners cry? No, such was not the fate of young Stephen Dowling Botts. Though sad hearts frowns and thickens, 'twas not from sickness shouts. No whooping cough did rack his frame, nor measles stream with spots. Not these impaired the sacred name of Stephen Dowling Botts. Despised love struck not with blow, that head of curly knots, nor stomach trembles lay him low, young Stephen Dowling Botts. Oh no, then lifts with tearful eye, whilst I fate do tell, his soul did from this cold world fly, by falling down low. They got him out and into him, alas it was too late, the spirit was gone, far too aloft, and the realms looking good and great.
All right, so I want you to take a pencil, and I want you to go, and I want you to analyze that poem. It's supposed to be, as I say, a parody of good poetry. She thinks it's good, Huck thinks it's good, her parents think it's good. It is an ode. We don't know a lot about odes because I didn't tell you much, but what can you tell me about an ode?
For someone that's dead.
What?
Is it a poem about someone who died?
That would be an elegy,
Oh, shoot.
but a poem that's an ode is a formal poem. That's all you need to know. Remember To Autumn? That's an ode by John Keats. It's usually in praise of some abstract idea. In this case, it is an elegy, but it's kind of, she calls it an ode, so she doesn't even have the title right, really.
Yes.
But it's supposed to be a formal poem. Read it one more time and tell me what is it about it that makes it not good poetry. You ought to be able at this point at least, this is a good poem, this is not a good poem. You ought to be able to distinguish between that. All right, Todd, give me one thing that you noticed that's in the poem that she does, some technique she uses, or something she said meaning Emmeline Granger, if it's really Mark Twain. What does she, tell me something she does, and ultimately, these will add up. Remember, it's supposed to be a serious poem, and it's about a serious thing, a guy died. So you got two things that should be very serious, right? The poem should be serious, because it's about a serious event. What did you notice about it?
It has a rhyme scheme.
It does. That in itself doesn't tell us much yet, but I think it will. Sicken and thicken. That does have rhyme. Give me something else, Tyler.
They kind of like involve different ways of how you can die, kind of like it's a more fictional story, kind of like doing it up or something, instead of like saying you died this way.
Yeah, now, think about what she's trying to do, right? She's trying to honor Stephen Dowling Bots. So why would you spend the majority of your time telling the things he didn't die of? You know, it talks about all the things he didn't die of. I thought you were honoring the person, not his way of dying. So that's a good point. That's a little bit strange for her to do that.
I feel like she's kind of making fun of him, or not trying to, but like, it just seems this
She's
way.
not intending to,
Yeah,
but she is.
But like, sometimes sickness isn't like a thing that you can help, and so she's saying these ways of like sickness that people can't help, but she's like, and he fell down a well, like something that could have been preventable, and like, he could have just like not done, like he probably was playing around and shouldn't have been doing that.
So what are you saying about that manner of death?
She's just kind of making fun of him because it's not usual for someone to die going down a well.
A grown-up adult
Yeah.
falling down a well, that's, at the very least, it's not a very heroic way to die, is it?
And like I said before, sickness wasn't the thing they could have prevented.
That's a good point. These other things you couldn't help, but that is just klutziness, right? How could a grown man fall down a well? How about it, Nick?
Well, I agree with Caleb was saying, it is rather embarrassing to die by falling down a well. But I think what's strange is, she kind of just passed over that, like really quickly. Like, even when she finally mentioned how he died, it was just one line.
Yeah.
And she kind of moved on.
That's a good point. She builds up to it and then,
She didn't dwell on it.
that's right,
She just kind of,
That's a-
okay, so he fell down a well, like whatever.
yeah. After you spend all this time, okay, what is it, okay, that's all you're gonna tell me? That's good, that's a good point, Matt.
At the end, like the last line, she says like, in the realms of good and great, and she's almost like contrast, I mean, she's not trying to, but she's contrasting like the way that he died, with being this heroic being, with that like, being like, in a place with heroic people.
Like the heroes who died heroic, very good, I like that, Davis.
Well, if it's supposed to be like honoring the guy, she doesn't talk about his life at all.
We know nothing about him, do we?
Yeah, like we don't know what kind of person he was, we just know that he died, kind of embarrassing.
Again, it's a fascination with death and the way people die, rather than the loss of a human life and what he meant to them. That's a very good point, Julia. Any other technique you see her using that, or Mark Twain, but Emmeline using that creates humor? And I'll go to John after Julie.
It's like in a sing-songy type beat, so it like.
Yes.
So it makes it seem like it's like a nursery rhyme or something.
Very good. That's a really good point. You mentioned the rhyme, was it was Todd. Plus the rhythm is very childish, very simplistic, childlike. Again, you're dealing with a serious topic. John and then Elizabeth.
I was just gonna say, there's like a lot of repetition.
What kinds of things does she repeat?
Well, he repeats his name like a lot.
Yes. Would you say like almost every stanza? Not quite, but what about his name, John? What can you say about that name? Remember, it's a fictitious character, but can you say anything about his name?
Kind of unusual, maybe, his name.
It's not unusual?
It is unusual.
Yeah, in what way? Anybody have a thought about his name? Yeah. Yeah,
It's like unusual.
good. Is it a heroic name?
No.
No, not at all. Doesn't sound very, it sounds funny, actually. Elizabeth,
I feel like the language she uses is kind of basic. You can kind of tell it's written by somebody that's young. It doesn't have a lot of meaning behind it.
can you take that a little further? Do you see certain kind of words that she does use in here that make it appear she's trying to imitate good poetry or old poetry?
I guess kind of saying like not whoa or like.
Good. What other words does she use that she seems to have like borrowed from like medieval language or Shakespeare?
She talks about fate and then aloft.
Very good. What about words like twas and whilst and alas? These are words that, you would hear in maybe Shakespeare. And it seems like she's using them to make it sound really fancy. Okay. Madison and
I
then
kind of said
Ethan.
what Liz.
Good, no, go ahead.
I kind of said what Elizabeth said, like the language is very plain and boring. You can kind of see that through how she explains like these embarrassing stories as childish.
Yes, very good. Anything, we've taken almost everything, Ethan. I don't think anything else could possibly be said about this poem. So if you can think of something that hasn't been said, I'd be really impressed.
I mean, you guys applied just like irony and sarcasm.
Yeah, where do you see both or either?
I guess irony, but like she lists all the ways. I mean, you guys already said it, but she lists all the ways that he could have died, and then he dies by falling down a hill.
So that would have been a good thing to add, whoever brought it up to begin with, is all the ways he didn't die. And so it's ironic that's a good word to describe the way he actually did die, which was not any of those other ways, and it's a very simple way. You notice the rhetorical questions? And did he sicken, and did he die, and did heart sicken? Yeah, that's a rhetorical technique. So she knows about rhetorical questions. She just doesn't use them very well. Yeah, that was it. Oh no. Then instead of listen, she says list. Then list with tearful eye. Listen with tearful eye, but she didn't say listen. She said list. That's kind of corny and old-fashioned. One last thing is the syntax. Notice this. Look at the one that says despise love. Would you find that? It's the third from the end. Despise, I'll say despised. She didn't say that, but despised love struck not with woe that head of curling knots. How would we normally say that in a normal sentence? Love did not strike his head with woe. You see, the sentence is rearranged so that it sounds more old-fashioned and it fits the... I'm actually impressed by your answers, because I've done this almost every year, and some people, they stare at it and they don't even know beginning, what is he talking about, which is a shame, because we're in February and you should know good poetry. What that shows me is that you know how to talk about poetry. You talked about the right things, and you pointed out how they're not appropriate for this poem. And that takes a little bit of sophistication. I'm handing it to you. And all of you said something. It wasn't just one or two of you. You all said something that was, I think, significant. So, well done. We're done. And tomorrow, please read the book, finish the book. Not the book, finish the chapters. You don't have to finish the book. I think it's 26. I will promise you, I will not give you 2 quizzes this week. So it may be tomorrow. I don't want to tell you, otherwise you might not read it. So one of the 2 days you'll get a quiz. One of the 2 days you won't. So just read it, and that's all I'm asking. And